Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by onlinegreatbooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. I'll let you introduce yourself. So, there you go. Go ahead. Hey, Marsha, who are you?
Hey, boy, put me on the spot there. I run the Great Connections seminar and leap year program, and I've been interested and involved in philosophy, in the great books, and in education for decades. And I'm very concerned about what's going on in education today.
Okay. What are you concerned about? I'll bite. I am too.
Yeah, two different levels to it. On the one hand, I'm concerned about the things that are in the news lately, if you follow what's going on in education. For example, all the push in the colleges to clamp down on people actually speaking their minds about things because this or that idea is not the approved. I mean, it's kind of ironic that the left has been pushing this because they were the ones who were really against blacklisting people for their beliefs back in the 50s, supposedly. But now they're going to blacklist you if you have any idea that doesn't fit their paradigms, you know. What's going on in the academy, to me, is the result of a long-term effort to change the minds of young people.
Yeah, you recommended to me that I read an essay, an Ayn Rand essay, the Comprachicos. Is that how you pronounce that thing? Mm-hmm. Which is just about that. It's about how education forms the mind of the. I'm making scare quotes. The educated. So the Comprachicos were this sort of. I don't know if this is true or not. I looked it up. It's at least in folklore there was this group of sort of roaming kind of entertainer, gypsy kind of people. They would supposedly kidnap a kid and put him in a jar and then feed them until that kid was just deformed by growing up inside of this container. And then when they had reached a certain age, they would break that container and then they would put the kid on display at a freak show, like at a carnival. And that container, changed the shape of that person forever. And Rand's idea in that essay is that education changes the shape of the educated forever. We have to be careful about how that's done and how we allow that to happen and what our aims are.
Exactly. If you shape the mind at a young age, it's very, very difficult to change that shape, to make that person capable of thinking well, of getting out of the cave, as Plato says.
Right. Yeah. From time to time, I call Online Great Books members who've been going to seminars just to see what's going on. What do they think of the seminar experience? What can we do to make it better? And the main complaint or comment is that they don't really know what to expect, and that they don't know what they're going to be talking about, and that they would kind of like homework. Mm-hmm. and the point of the seminar is that you don't know what to expect, that it's going to be about the text, and that there is no homework. And their minds have been formed. They have been taught somehow that they can only have thought if it's mediated, and they can only have conversation if it's mediated. And we're working hard to try to undo that, but it's tough.
Well, one of the beautiful things about that kind of dialogue is that it helps a person learn how they can understand anything themselves firsthand. And if you're going to live in a free society, you have to be able to do that, because you have to be able to make a lot of choices and judge situations and decide what's best for yourself in that and take responsibility for it. So it's a wonderful setting to learn that kind of thing, to really hone your reasoning ability, because you're having to give evidence for whatever you're saying out of the text or your experience. And you're listening to the way other people reason about the same things. So you're gaining skills by hearing other very good ways of coming at things, right?
Yeah, it makes you more empathetic. You have to listen to that other person and be attuned to them. It's fascinating.
Yes.
But you've been concerned about education, well, your whole adult life and probably before then. And I learned about you through our mutual friend Malachi Walsh, who's been on this podcast, and he says, "Oh no, you've got to meet Marsha." And so you sent me this email, and your email, your last name's Enright, and your first name's Marsha. So your email starts with MENRIGHT. I thought, oh my gosh, I got some men's rights activist that's emailed me here, and I opened it up and met you, and you're just a delight. And
Oh, thank you.
one of the things there's so many things I like about you, but one of the things I like most is you weren't happy with the school situations that you could find for your children. So you just, tell everybody what you did.
Yeah, well, I've actually been concerned about education since I was a kid because unlike a lot of people, I really loved school. I loved to learn. I was just eager to soak up whatever they were going to give me. But so many other kids were goofing around all the time. They were frustrating because they would interfere with the learning until I realized that they were doing that because they were so frustrated.
Yep.
They were so unhappy with the circumstances. And I also didn't like school. What I didn't like about school was the social situation, which I thought was very damaging to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's poisonous.
Yeah. And it tended to encourage pack mentality. And so I said to myself, well, I don't want this to happen to my kids when I grow up. So what kind of system would be good for them? And I kind of had it in the back of my mind, all the time I was growing up. And when I was about 20, I ran into some articles about the Montessori method by a Montessorian named Beatrice Hessen, who had a school out in California. And she summarized what the Montessori method was about. And I said, whoa, this sounds really good. I think I like this idea. So I went out and read everything I could about the method, and I started observing at schools. And I said, okay, this is what I want for my kids.
Can you summarize what the Montessori method is?
Probably some basics of it. Yeah. The Montessori method is a developmentally oriented educational system. In other words, it's created in a way to give kids what they need at the different times of their lives, because they need different kinds of things at different times. Like when you're very young, you're under 6, you need a lot of sensory motor work. When you're 6 to 9 years old, you're starting to wake up to ideas, and you're becoming very philosophical about the world. What is everything? Why is the world the way it is? And so forth. When you're a young adult, which is the age that I'm concerned about, you're trying to find your place in life, and you're trying to find, okay, what is my mission in life? What way will I be most productive? Will I feel the best about myself? Will I find a meaningful life? And so each level requires a different kind of attention. So that's number one. And Montessori figured this out back in the early 1900s. She was the first woman doctor in Italy, and she was very schooled in biology. And she brought her knowledge about biology and actually embryological development to the idea of the development of the mind. And she said that the young child is the spiritual embryo. And she didn't mean spiritual in the mystical sense, but in the sense of an unfolding spirit inside. So how do we nurture that? So it's very developmentally oriented. And she was the one to first discover, or to first really implement. She didn't discover it, but first fully implement the idea that young children, for example, learn best if you have concrete materials that embody the concepts that you're trying to teach them. So, for example, we teach mathematics to 3-year-olds by using beads,
right,
that represent numbers, and they end up being able to do equations up into the thousands with the beads, and then later on they learn how to symbolize those. But they have this like really great concrete idea in their mind of what the numbers mean. And there's literally hundreds of math materials, biology materials, history materials. History, for example, is taught by timelines. So U.S. history is taught by the terms of the presidents, and the child will make a gigantic timeline on the floor with little figures of the president, and then he'll relate all of the things that he learns about the different times of the different presidents to that timeline. And it gives a really solid, concrete thing to keep in your mind. Because you see, the human mind has, in a certain sense, two different elements in it. It has the older perceptual ability to grasp the world of seeing, sensing.
You mean like older in like prehistoric or?
Yes, right,
Right.
right, exactly. I'm sorry. Yeah, prehistoric. The more animal level of our consciousness.
That's where I like to operate.
You are fooler about that. And then we have this newer ability that arose, I don't know, it seemed very clearly to arise about 50,000 years ago. There's a lot of controversy about it, which is our ability to reason about things or to think in abstractions. And we are able to look at 10 dogs, and we're able to see the similarities between them and come up with the idea dog. And then that's really powerful, right?
Right. This is where you get mad at Plato. Like if you guys go listen to our discussions about the Republic, this is where Marsha gets mad at Plato for talking about the form of dogs, like this mystical dogness that's out there somewhere that we know that all dogs partake in. That's where Marsha gets irritated with him.
Well, I'm a very solid Aristotelian.
Right.
Epistemologically, psychologically, biologically, all that. And anyway, but your mind, the human mind, has to be able to connect that abstract thing with the concrete world, and has to connect the two functions, the perceptual function with the abstract function, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why we need a lot of concrete things to represent the abstractions. Words are the main one that we use. They're like an audiovisual symbol we used. So this is why for children, it's really important to have concrete materials to represent the abstractions that you're trying to teach them.
So in Marsha's epistemology, a word is a concrete?
Well, the audiovisual part of it is.
Okay, I dig it.
Yeah.
I think this is where I should also say that you are a psychologist as well.
Right. Well, in the sense that I'm very interested in psychology. Anyway, yeah, I have a master's.
Yes. And
the certification people might not call me a psychologist.
Oh, yeah? We don't like those guys anyway.
Anyway, where was I? Oh, and so in Montessori, we have all these concrete materials, all the different subjects. They're arranged in order of difficulty. The children work on their own individual work. With the idea that each person develops differently. The teacher's job is to be really observant about the individual children and then kind of feed them the lessons they need on the different materials in small groups. And the classroom is arranged with shelves of the materials all around. And the child can work with other people if they want, but they don't have to. But they're responsible with the materials to go get them from the shelves, put them on their own space, work on them, and then put them away. And what happens is because they are not forced to share with other people, they really like to.
And so you were looking at the educational environment in the Chicago area, and you had kids, and you knew about this Montessori method, and you weren't happy with the options that were available for your children. So being Marsha, you said, well, I'll just go create what I need.
Well, yeah, I had to. I mean, there wasn't... Actually, what happened was there was a Montessori magnet program in a local Chicago public school that had been... There's a strong Montessori influence here in my neighborhood. I live in the Beverly Hills, Morgan Park neighborhood of Chicago. It's on the far southwest side. And it has a lot of professionals and civil servants and business people that live here. And so there was a group of people that 45 or 50 years ago started a Montessori preschool here. And my children went there. And then those people and others in the neighborhood had managed to get a magnet program started in the local public school. And I went to observe that magnet program, thinking maybe I'd put my son in that when he was ready to go to first grade. But it was really uncertain. In other words, if you got one teacher in that program, They were very Montessori. It was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones didn't know what they were doing. So I didn't want to leave it up to that. And I found a Montessori school in the nearby suburb of Blue Island that was working, a private one, and my children. So I ended up sending my son there. But when he got to third grade, they were going to close because they had to leave their building. And we tried to, some of the other parents that I had gotten to know, tried to get them to move over to the Beverly Hills neighborhood. We found a space because there was much more interest in Montessori here. But the directors didn't want to. And so that's when I said to myself, okay, how about if we start our own place?
Stage a coup.
And I had the good fortune of meeting a brilliant, wonderful Montessori teacher when my children were in the preschool, Diana Butler, who then, when this came up, was working in the Kankakee Public Schools in a Montessori program, but that was like an hour drive. And I thought, maybe she'd rather work for us right down the block. And then it turned out she said to me that she'd always wanted to start a school, but she didn't think she could do it herself. So that's how we started.
You and I haven't ever talked about this thing, but so you're a great books person. How do you think that the kind of great books method falls on the Montessori developmental model? So adults seem to benefit a great deal from using the texts to learn about abstractions, to learn about how to think. Like the mechanics of thinking, actually, it seems to be a good way to learn those things. Have you related that? Have you ever thought about that in terms of the Montessori model and how that would go from the pedagogy for the kids, like pediatrician, and the ped part, to the andragogy thing, the adult, the human, fully developed person?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Because as I said, in Montessori, the principle is the big principle in Montessori is that you cannot know what any person needs to learn. It's what Montessori called the mystery of the child. You can know the things that would be very useful for them to learn. And so the best thing to do is to create a very rich environment that's appropriate for the way they need to learn. And then you're the guide. As the teacher, you're the guide. You're not the authority on the information. You're authoritative in the sense that you're very knowledgeable, but it's up to them to learn the details. So since it's developmental at the young adult level, that's the age at which and the adult level, at which you're trying to develop your reasoning powers and your most abstract ideas so you can figure out what to do with your life and how to navigate your life. And the wonderful thing about the great books is you've got these people who are the most amazing thinkers that have ever lived. And when you read them, it's so contemporary. I mean, once you get past the ancient language or whatever, what they're talking about is so contemporary, and they grapple with the same problems we have today. And so you get to see how somebody like that did it, and that's why it helps your reasoning so much.
Yeah, the Montessori seems to believe that functioning in objective reality puts the pressure on the person to then figure out what they need to know. Like there's an emergent quality to education that if you put somebody in the real world, they very quickly discover what things they need to know in order to live the good life, as opposed to have some highly curated curriculum based. I don't know. What's the most recent federal initiative in public schools? What do they call it? Common Core, right? It's very Aristotelian, right? They have faith that objective reality will put a pressure on somebody that will lead them to the thing they need to know, and it doesn't necessarily have to be curated. Yeah, and I love that. I'm an adult, I think, and
you look like one.
I look like one. I know. Look at these wrinkles. I had a lady the other day ask me what this scar was. It's not. It's a wrinkle because I hate everything. Yeah. I seem to be able to unschool myself and still learn new skills. I've been out of school longer than in school, and I've learned more since I left school than I did when I was there. Like, unschooling seems to work for us, and my kids are doing it too, actually, and it's fine. Mm-hmm. They're just fine.
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with traditional education is it's not really organized for the benefit of the student. For the needs of the student. And so this is why it's so frustrating to so many people. And that's why it's such a contrast to something like Montessori. You were talking about butting up against the real world and having to learn something. In the Montessori program, real world activities are always included, whether it's cooking, whether it's learning how to run a business, whether it's doing a play, figuring out how to go on a field trip. So it's what she calls practical life activities. Those are always incorporated to help with that kind of issue that you're talking about.
Yeah. So I was telling you that one of the main reasons that people don't join us is, well, one is the price, which I can't really do anything about. Another one is they're not sure they have time to do the reading and join us in this. And then another one. And it's rare that I get someone to be honest with me about this, but another reason that people don't take up a study of the great books or really or lots of different educational endeavors is they don't think they're up to it. They don't think they can do it. They don't think they can do the reading. And you said, gosh, I think I could help with that. And so we were talking about how we might help people get up to the tasks of reading, and we realized that, well, most people know phonics and they can sound out words and they can use a dictionary, and they've got the kind of the basic skills they need to actually decode the symbols on the page. The problem is really about confidence and practice. And you said well, maybe we could help them with some sentence stems. And I said, Nathaniel Brandon, you ever his work? And you're like, oh yeah. So tell about that.
Oh, sure. Well, he was an associate of Ayn Rand for many years, and he became a psychologist. He developed this methodology that's really powerful and useful called sentence completion.
Yeah.
In which you have the beginning of a sentence like, when I talk to my mother, I feel, and then ... And what you're supposed to do with this is you're just supposed to fill in immediately what you think when you read that sentence. And if you do this over a period of time with some of these wonderful sentence stems, you start to understand, you start to bring up material that you didn't even realize was in your mind about the subjects. And it's very helpful for working through problems that you have in which you didn't know what was going on in your subconscious, or what were the ideas and the values, the premises that were driving you to feel the way you do.
Yeah, it's like a guided introspection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's a good way of putting it. Mm-hmm.
But where I wanted you to go with that was, you said, oh yeah, I used to hang out with Ayn Rand in the 70s in New York City.
Oh, well, not exactly. I mean, at that point in the 70s, I was in graduate school, and she was in her 70s, and some of her associates were running courses in the Statler Hilton, where they'd always run courses. And I went to them, and the thing was, she was always there, and you could go up and talk to her whenever you wanted. So, but it seemed like people, she had a reputation for being very judgmental. And so I think people were scared.
You don't say.
To talk to her. Yeah.
But what course? I got to interrupt you. What courses were you there? Were like Peikoff's Introduction to Objectivism and Introduction to Logic, and which ones were you going to?
A couple that I went to were, I think it was History of Philosophy.
Uh-huh.
And then Alan Blumenthal did a course on music. I remember those two. Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't remember if I went to any others. But anyway, my attitude about her was, my mother yells at me all the time, so what?
Right.
So I'm just going to go up and talk to her, and if she yelled at me, oh well. But I actually found her to be just very lovely to me, very lovely. I was about 25 at the time. I don't know whether she, and she was an elderly lady, so I don't know how old she thought I was. So I don't know if I got any, extra benefit from the fact that she thought I was a very young person. But she always listened very carefully to what I was asking and gave her best answer. And if what I asked wasn't clear and she was like not going the right way, I'd say, no, I mean this, and she'd stop and she'd change it. And I had all kinds of delightful conversations with her, even including about cats and jewelry.
Right. That's fantastic. There are a lot of accounts of her being kind with questions and very, very patient with questions. As long as somebody was a good faith questioner, I think that she must have been pretty kind. She's definitely at the heart of a teacher. I mean, she spent her whole life just trying to make people understand the contents of her mind.
Well, the ironic thing is she gets attacked all the time for her concept of what she called selfishness.
Right.
Because people misunderstand it, or they dissemble about it, that it's all about, just doing whatever you want and doesn't matter what it does to other people and all. Well, she didn't mean that at all. But the ironic thing about it is, if you look at what she did, she devoted her life to try to making life better for other people.
Yeah.
And her characters, like in Atlas Shrugged, they give up their careers in order to try to change the world. So it's really ironic. But I have to tell you one thing. She did ask my forgiveness one time. You want to hear the story?
Well, I do want to hear the story, but first, I don't think many people would ever think that she ever asked for forgiveness for anything. But
I know, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I was just this young girl, right? I don't even know if she knew my name, but I was waiting to talk to her husband. I talked to her one time, and she was talking to somebody else, and her husband was next to her. And I could tell at that point that he must have had a stroke at some point, because he was what's called aphasic, where he could understand what you were saying, but he couldn't respond very easily, talk very easily. And it's a very common result of strokes, very common. So I was making conversation with him and asking him about his painting, because he was an artist. And she kept looking over at me, madder and madder, because she was very protective of him at the time. And then all of a sudden she stops. She says, "Don't bother him. He's not an objectivist. He's my husband. He's my husband." And I knew she didn't know what we were talking about, so I kind of shrugged and I walked away. And
Marsha shrugged.
Yeah, exactly. And at the next break, she comes over and finds me, and she says to me, and Frank must have straightened her out. And she comes over and finds me, and she says to me, "Darling, please forgive me. I didn't know what you were talking about." So that's the story.
Well, that's that paints a little different picture of her than most people would believe. It's so good to hear a firsthand account of someone that got to hang around with someone like that. No matter what you think of them, if I could talk to somebody, if I could hear some Slavoj Žižek stories, I'd want to hear them. I mean,
yeah.
So
what they're like in person.
Yeah.
I was just telling Carl yesterday that I so wish I could have known Aristotle as a person.
Oh, listen, I read Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, and that's what led me to Aristotle. Yep. Because is there anything new or novel in that book? I mean, it's just Aristotelianism, isn't it? I mean,
there's a couple new ideas that are really important.
Lay it on me. One
is the grounding of abstractions in the idea that what your mind is doing. Okay, so the big problem is, how are we coming up with the abstraction when we're looking at a bunch of concrete things?
Yeah, this is Plato's problem of the forms. You see a stool and a recliner and a stump that someone sits on, and you go, oh, those are chairs. Mm-hmm. But yet they're nothing alike. So that's the problem of thought.
Right. Or even you could have 3 Labradors, but they are different sizes and they have slightly different conformations. So how are you thinking they're all the same thing? A dog, And her answer to that is that you are mentally removing or separating. You're mentally separating the things that are similar between them from the amount in which they're there. So you're noticing the shape of the dog, but you're not keeping the idea of the exact measurements of the dog. And it's what she calls measurement omission. So this solves the problem of how we get from the concrete to the abstract. And that's not something that Aristotle did.
Right, that's true. Yeah,
so that's one thing.
Yeah, she makes she doesn't explain it. I don't think it's been a while since I read this. She doesn't explain it, but she makes allowance for our mind sort of filtering irrelevancies like fur color or size, and be able to see and integrate what the things common and definitive about that thing are, so that you can integrate and make a new concept of it, of dogness.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the power of abstraction that the human mind has.
Yeah.
And it fuels everything. I mean, because there's a new book out called Sapiens.
Uh-huh.
I'm just reading, and I'm kind of divided about it. But he talks about what he calls the cognitive revolution about 40,000 years ago, where all of a sudden humans were able to do all kinds of things that they couldn't do before. And clearly, this was a point at which abstractions took off.
Yeah.
The ability to use them took off.
I'm afraid we may be losing that. Because people say, oh, but I know a woman who's taller than men. Some men, oh my gosh, come on.
Yeah.
So we were talking about...
You want to get back to your reading course though, right?
Well, we'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get there. So yeah, we were having this conversation about, why, how can we help people overcome their worries, their fears, their insecurities about this reading, and give them the confidence to actually do the work. And Marsha says, yeah, I can do that. So I could do that. And so you've created a reading course for us that will be opening up and making available to the public very soon, and probably to coincide with the release of this podcast, actually, ma'am. So tell us about what you are doing with that thing.
Well, what I'm doing is applying Montessori psychological principles to helping people learn how to read. And I wanted to go back a little bit to what we do in Montessori with the kids, which is that when the materials that they use with the kids are ingeniously created to be just challenging enough to be interesting, but not so challenging as to be overwhelming.
Right.
And so that the child can work on this particular aspect of whatever concept they're trying to learn, and not get too frustrated. Well, this is a principle of, I don't know how many people in the audience have heard of the researcher Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. And one of the main things he discovered is that you get into flow. We know flow, for example, from a lot of people know flow or getting in the zone from athletics, right? Where you're really concentrating and you're performing at your best, and you forget about all your worries and concerns. You're just really focused on the thing that you're doing. And when you're done, you're tired, but you come out of it with a sense of real enjoyment and accomplishment. And this experience can happen in almost anything, depending on the circumstances. He said the circumstances are that it's just challenging to keep your interest, but not so challenging as to be overwhelming.
Right.
So this is the problem with reading, right? Is that many people, the education that they had was not individualized to them. So they couldn't go at their own pace to master reading, whatever their interests or their difficulties or their strengths were. And so they got whatever they could out of it, but they didn't end up actually mastering reading.
Yeah, they either get bored and quit, or they flounder and quit.
Right.
Yeah.
Or exactly, both of those. So what I've tried to do in the reading course is figuring that people that are coming to it are ones that feel they have a problem with reading, is because the ancient texts can be very daunting to try to read them. You've got the old language, and then you've got very abstract ideas, a lot of times ones that the new readers have never even thought about consciously. And there's a lot going on. And then the vocabulary it has to be mastered.
So I want to interrupt and say, we're not going to teach them phonics. Like, we're assuming that these are going to be adults, and they've got the skills. They've got the basic stuff for decoding the symbols. The problem is practice, integration, confidence, and these other kind of, third order problems that come up, right? And so the problems of vocabulary in these things, the problems of the abstractions in these things, the problems of the maybe arcane language or the weird sentence formulations that come in these old books. That's the kind of stuff, and the confidence, that's the stuff you're trying to tackle here for these people.
Exactly. Because, I think almost anybody can read these books if they have certain kinds of skills, if they can develop certain kinds of skills. And the other thing is they have to stay interested, because how well and fast you can learn something if you're interested in it, versus when somebody else tells you, oh, do this. That's the other problem with traditional education, is you're constantly being told, do this, and you aren't particularly interested in it.
Right.
And what you need to be, here's where the teacher's job is to kind of seduce the students into seeing why this thing is interesting, And so I've tried to create some classes where I'll be the guide to certain kinds of materials, and I will be we'll do it in a step form, so that we start with something that's really interesting but really short, and talk about that, and then talk about the experience of it. And I try to provide tools that will the person can use to self-explore and learn where their problems are, and maybe come back and say, well, I need help with this. And then the other aspect is I'm there to be able to show why it's so hard to read these texts, so that the participants don't feel like there's something wrong with them because they have a problem with it. There's nothing wrong with you if you have difficulty reading these things. They're hard.
Yeah, if you've cracked the book and you've gone far enough to realize it's tough, you're in the 1% or less. Like most people,
Exactly.
Most people won't even think about even trying it. I tell people all the time that when I read one of these more important, more difficult texts, I'm really lucky if I get 5% of the thing, or 8% or something like that. These books they have something for everyone at every level. And when I read it, I may get 5-8%. However you can quantify that, I don't even know, right? But I don't get it all. And then the next time I read it, I might get 3 or 4% of something different from it, and I get more and more from each reading. And I have to be kind to myself and allow myself to not get it all. And you're incorporating some of those kind of Brandonian,
yeah.
Sentence stems to help people, learn about, why they may have anxiety about it, why they may have confidence problems with undertaking the work. And hopefully through doing that, they learn to be kind to themselves as a learner. The part of us which is learning shares something with the part of us that was a child at one point. And we have to be kind to that part of ourselves, just like it was a kid. Like you were teaching a kid to tie their shoes, or learn to ride a bike, or anything else. And sometimes we have a hard time doing that.
Exactly. And then in the sentence stem work is something that the person does privately, and they don't have to share if they don't want to. If they want to, it's great, because sometimes you can plumb more knowledge out of it by talking about it. But if they don't want to, they don't have to. But it could be very useful to themselves anyway.
Yeah.
And
the problem that the individual has that they share with themselves when completing the sentence stem, probably isn't unique. They're probably not the only one that has that problem with it. I talk to people. I actually call quite a few people. We have this VIP waiting list, and I'll call people after we close enrollment and say, hey, help me out. I want to do a better job here. I see that you didn't sign up. I understand. But could you tell me what I could do better to maybe attract, you to read with us? And I get all kinds of feedback. And some of it is, I don't think I can do it. And I talk to these people and I ask why, and I get stories about I've told this one several times. I'll tell it again. Someone was very excited about reading Hamlet or something like that, and they wrote a paper that they were proud of. They turned it in, and that old cow gave them a C. And the next thing you know, they're 40 years old, and they think that they can't do the work. Well, how do you give somebody a C on Hamlet? How do you give somebody a C? How do you do that? But that damages people, or they. A lot of these stories are around Shakespeare, by the way. We were going to read Julius
Such a
Caesar.
shame too, because he's so fabulous.
Yeah, it's terrible. We were going to read. We were reading in my 10th grade, whatever. We were going to read Julius Caesar. We were going to read Romeo and Juliet, and I had to read Mercutio, and I couldn't pronounce this word. Reading it out loud, and couldn't pronounce this word, and everybody laughed. And people are like, it wrecks them forever if they let it. Well, maybe not if they let it, but if they don't resist it, if they don't actively, rewrite that story for themselves about their reading, they're stuck with it. And so we hope that we can help people kind of rewrite that and understand that everybody mispronounces the words. By the way, my sister, she says you should never make fun if someone mispronounces a word because they got it because they read it. If you hear it, you're going to get it right because the only way you knew that word was the way it's commonly spoken. And so we all mispronounce words, and if we mispronounce it, it's probably because we got it through our own independent work. So that's a good thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Moreover, English is such a crazy car crash of languages that it's not always easy to figure out how you're supposed to pronounce this word or that word.
That's the soundbite.
That's something we'll talk about in the reading course is how to understand the various word lines in English to help you understand the words better.
That's the tagline for this show. Marsha saying English is a crazy car crash of languages.
It is.
It is, though. Yeah. So your reading confidence building course, skill building course is 8 weeks. And we're gonna send people some excerpts for some short readings. I don't think there's anything more than 2 or 3 pages long. I think the longest thing would be maybe 3 pages at the most. I can't remember. And then we'll meet in a Zoom online classroom once a week. Actually, every other week, I think. Actually, isn't that right?
I think so.
And discuss the work from the week that we were supposed to be doing the week before, which will be that short selection. It might be a little poem. It might be something from one of our state documents, and maybe your sentence stems if you want to. And let's start building our confidence and skills in doing the reading. And we're going to charge for it, but it's $99 and it's a one-time fee, and you get those 8 sessions with high empathy educator extraordinaire, Marsha.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to say is I know that each person in who would come to the course is very individual, and I apply the principle of the mystery of the human being to them. So I can't know what they need. All I can do is provide them with the richest environment and try to give them what they need in this situation.
You're Virgil. You're their guide. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to do that with young people, too, in a new program that I'm starting next year. For the last 10 years, I've run a summer program for young people called the Great Connections. And we've decided to expand it into what's called a gap year program. So a lot of kids nowadays are questioning whether they should go to college or should they do something else. Should they start a business? Should they go into the trades or arts? So they're taking a year off after high school to figure that out. But most of the years are travel or learning a language or experiencing other cultures, but they're not
or eating Cheetos.
Pardon?
Or eating Cheetos and playing video games,
Yeah, but they're not specifically oriented to really build the skills and the knowledge and the experiences that you need to figure out what to do for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've designed this program to do.
Where do they go to look into that? I think that, well, before you give that plug, I think that everyone needs to take a very, very, very serious look at college. Even if you think that that's the thing you need to do and you're pretty set on it as a young person, I think they really need to evaluate that carefully. I suspect I'll go on the record saying this. I suspect that our society is going to become more and more striated socially and economically along lines of college attendance, but in a very different way than it had been. In 1945, if you had a 4-year college degree, you were like one of something like 8% of the population. It was very, very low, and those people had high incomes, and for a long time, it was a path to economic success. But I think it's going to invert. I think that I think that 15 years from now, a young person who graduates from college is very, very likely to have a debt burden that, by the way, cannot be relieved through bankruptcy. There's no jubilee for student debt burden. And they have spent some of the most energetic and formative years of their life obtaining something of dubious value. Meanwhile, the young person who maybe got a journeyman's electrician's license and owns all their own tools and has no debt at age 22, the person who gets out of college at that same age with the debt can never catch that person economically. And unfortunately, economics are tied to some degree to our relationships. If you are crushed and destroyed by debt, household and family formation is almost impossible. I think that we're in danger of people who go to college generally being put at a great disadvantage and being marginalized in society forever. That probably sounds pretty radical, but you can imagine if somebody goes to State U with some kind of odd art history degree or something like that, and I'm pro-humanities, right? But some sort of odd degree and $120,000 in debt they can never get rid of. That person has a weight around their neck that the young tradesperson who's debt-free and has high skill acquisition already isn't burdened with. And I think that it has huge political consequences for the world, and of course huge individual consequences for the people that get in that situation. So even if you think you want to go to school, they need to be there's an economic component to it that cannot be ignored, and because of the internet and the way information now moves around, there are very few things that universities offer that cannot be gotten in other places at lower cost in both time and money. So pull the handbrake and cool it for a minute and go join Marsha and see what else is out there, and maybe find an alternative to college. Or even if you don't find an alternative to college, know why you are going to college. Go to it resolute and firm in the knowledge of what your motivation is, right? And I think that's what your gap career program can help them do. How about that for a soapbox?
I couldn't agree with you more about what's going on with college. The prices in college are a gigantic form of welfare to the universities and the colleges.
Yeah,
that were caused by the so-called free government loans. I one time, to test this, I realized this about what was going on with college prices back in about 2005. And so to test it, I looked up what my college should cost today if it were just straight inflation. And I went to Northwestern in the 70s, where it was a very expensive $3,000 a year tuition. And if by inflation alone, it should be $16,000 a year, or it was in 2005. They're charging about $50,000 right now in tuition, and of course, it's partly because it's one of the hot universities too. Like Yale, and but this is true across the board with tuition prices. It's been gigantic.
I went to the University of Oklahoma in the early 90s. It cost me about $3,000 a year, books and tuition and lab fees and so on, and I haven't looked lately, but it's probably on the order of $25,000 to $30,000 a year for those things now at the University of Oklahoma, and that's not that's by no that ain't Northwestern.
Well, and there's two factors. I mean, a major factor is they've added all of these administrative positions that they have to support with, and the fact that they're nonprofits mostly, and so they don't have to conform them. They don't have to be as efficient as possible. I mean, think about all the wasted real estate in the summer where it's hardly used, Where would that happen elsewhere?
Yeah, the bankruptcy laws and the fact that those debts can be incurred so young. I just recently sold my main business, and we've been big savers our whole lives. I'm in a very, very good position now that I'm at 44 years old. But I took advantage of compounding interest very early on. I mean, I opened IRA and mutual fund accounts when I was 19 years old, and so that being able to sock some money away in your 20s is worth more than socking a lot away in your 60s, and to lose that opportunity because you have to retire student loan debt means there's going to be a lot of people looking for that Walmart greeter job when they're 65 and 70 later on because they had student loan debt in their 20s. It makes me sad. But go to onlinegreatbooks.com and you can go click join now and then join Marsha's reading course. It's going to be a limited number of people. I think we're going to have 25 seats. If you're not on the VIP waiting list, you probably won't get it. You probably won't get in. There are a bunch of people on that waiting list, and we'll give them a sneak peek, and I imagine that will sell out in about 8 minutes, actually. But we'll continue to host that and hopefully help more people get into big books. And even if you don't read them with us, you should go read them with you read them yourself, read them with your family, start a group at your house, because actually reading these books isn't a solitary activity. I mean, I think that reading is one of the few things that you can't do for somebody else, Marsha. You can't deadlift for somebody else, and you can't read for somebody else. But taking action on the book by discussing it with someone else is when we start to be changed by the thing. So go take the reading course, improve those reading skills, and then start your own damn group, everybody. And then go join that. Send your kids to the gap year thing. Don't just send them straight off into the maw of the debt machine and make them futon surfers for the rest of their life.
Yeah, we're calling ours the Great Connections Leap Year because we want to help students leap into their futures.
I love it. I've got a 16-year-old. I may end up having to send her to you here in a couple of years. It. Yeah.
I wanted to say one thing about your analysis of what's going on with education today and how you could learn almost anything without going to school.
Yeah.
It depends on whether you know how to learn. And that's the big rub, is to get those skills. And that's why those skills, people denigrate the liberal arts. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's partly because of the way that the liberal arts have been taught the last 30, 40 years, which is nonsense. And they don't, in so many places, they don't have you read the greatest thinkers. But the liberal arts is the best way to prepare yourself for life, because you learn how to think about anything, any right. subject. And you don't need an authority to tell you how to come to a conclusion about it.
Right.
And then you can go learn anything.
Yeah. It's, we all know what the traditional argument against liberal arts education has been. It's like, well, that doesn't get you a job. And oftentimes that's true, it's becoming, as these college prices go up, the luxury of getting yourself an education from St. John's or Amherst or one of these small liberal arts colleges is it's just not in the cards for most normal people. So but 150 years ago, 200 years ago, most of that stuff was done really independently. It wasn't actually done in a university setting, and it can still be done that way. This thing that we call education in North America, what we call traditional education in North America, is actually a 150-year-old experiment that we're just now seeing how well it runs. It's neither traditional nor maybe even education, and it's a social experiment that we're getting to watch play out for the better or worse right now.
If people are interested in the history at all, a woman named Kirsten Lombard recruited me to write a chapter for a book she put together called Common Ground on Common Core. And she has 17 wonderful essays in there from all different political perspectives about Common Core and what's happened with it. But she asked me to write one on what would education be like in a free society, a freer society than we have. Mm-hmm. And in that chapter, I have a lot of information about the history of education. You'll love this. So one of the main prosecutors of the idea of public school was a guy named Horace Mann, who started it in Boston back in 1832. By 1837, he's complaining about public education with the same kinds of complaints you hear today. The children don't learn how to read. They're
Right.
just all this. It's just amazing. And so anybody interested, I have it in that chapter.
Yeah, Mann supposedly went to Prussia and, and then came back here and wanted to institute their Prussian, education system. When he went there, school was out. He never even saw a classroom in operation at that time.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. But what I do know is that the Prussian system was specifically organized to make people be able to be obedient to the state.
Yeah. Yeah, so the way I have the story is Napoleon rolled Prussia up twice, and they said never again, and they undertook the Prussian state undertook some sort of an analysis to try to figure out why they were so ineffective, why their military was so ineffective, and why they weren't able to protect themselves from the People's Army, and they determined that their people were too independent. They were conscripts. They were tradesmen. They were farmers, and they didn't show up to battles on time and didn't stand in straight lines and weren't compliant enough. And so they instituted this Prussian system where the classrooms are based on platoon sizes. People move by the belt or by the whistle. They stand in line, and so it has a heavy compliance and structural component more than an educational component. That's why they call it school and not education. Schooling is very, very different than education. Education can take place in schools, but not necessarily. And so, the Prussians undertook that from my understanding is, to improve the quality and the quality of their military, which, they needed. Like I said, Napoleon rolled them up twice, and that ain't good, but we then took that, instituted that here, and we added a little Taylorism, a little time motion study, industrial analysis and management kind of stuff to it, and have used this to create a workforce, to drive GDP, and maybe not human flourishing, and maybe not happiness, and maybe not well-being. Well, that's enough of that. That's an hour, ma'am.
It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, it's a whole lot of fun. We're going to get hate mail from this one. It's going to be awesome. Well, that is another Online Great Books podcast. Go to onlinegreatbooks.com, and you can go up to the top right-hand corner and click Join Now. If enrollment's open, you can join. And if it ain't open, you can join our little VIP waiting list. And if you get on the waiting list, you'll get first crack at these special things we do, like Marsha's reading course or our Euclid course or those other little goodies. And, of course, you'll get a discount code for regular enrollment when we do open enrollment. Thanks so much for listening.